Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times bestselling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hey, Standard Deviations listeners. Did you know that you could be receiving continuing education credit for listening to certain podcast episodes? That's right. There are continuing education credits available for CFP board advisors, along with CMAs, CPWAs, and RMAs for certain episodes. The Advisor Academy is Orion's free, continuing education platform for advisors where you can get CE credits on the go. The platform offers a handful of podcast episodes that you can either listen to or watch and receive CE credit. Check the podcast description for more details or visit orionadvisorakademy.myabsorb.com and use code PODCASTS, that's podcast with an S, to sign up. Note, not all podcast episodes qualify for CE credit. You must listen or watch through the Orion Advisor Academy to receive the credit. Visit orion.com/advisor-academy to learn more. Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and today I am joined by repeat guest, a member of a small but proud minority of guests who's been invited back twice because she was so awesome the first time, Cady North. She's here to talk about her new book, The Art of the Sabbatical. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Daniel.
Okay, so I am famous for inviting guests on who can give me free therapy. And I have been thinking about a sabbatical for ages now. And selfishly, I've had you on just to sort my life out. So we're gonna get to that last.
Love that.
But I want to start with a little bit about your story. This strikes me as the kind of project and the kind of book that you write when it's personally meaningful to you, that there's something about you and your vision and your story that made this personally meaningful. Am I right there? And if so, what is it that made this so personal for you?
Yeah, so I took a sabbatical 9 years ago. And back then, I never would have thought that the experience would stick with me as probably one of the most transformative times of my life. Not only was I able to have the time and space to figure out what I was going to do next, which is to become an entrepreneur and start my business, North Financial Advisors, but also, I was able to envision a way of working which wasn't so hustle focused anymore. I'm now really quite allergic to overwork and busyness for the sake of just being busy and feeling worthy, The experience definitely changed my life forever, and I just carry so many of the lessons I learned during that time with me today. But my clients are who actually inspired me to write this book. Since then, and really in the past maybe 5 years or so, I've just seen a huge surge of people coming to me asking to take a work break. And at this point, about 40% of my clients have taken a sabbatical themselves, and I've worked with them in their financial plan to support that. And that's a pretty staggering number when you think about it. Most of my clients are in their 30s and 40s, so they have a long way to go before retirement. So this is a new phase. This is a new thing that people are experimenting with. And I think when you couple that with what we see in statistics of there was an article earlier this year saying 50% of people want to leave their jobs this year and are burned out, right? COVID-19 taught us that there is another way of being, and, having more flexibility, freedom, and recharge time in our lives is going to be a part of that moving forward.
Incredible. So many threads to pull on there. When people are talking about these 40% of folks who are talking to you about taking a sabbatical, yours sounds transformative and as though, you learned a lot, you grew a lot. How much of the time are people trying to learn, grow, improve, and how much of the time do people just need a break? Do you see a sabbatical as typically more of one or the other?
I think people start off, the prime directive is often to recover from burnout or to get a better sense of balance in life, right? And so they start off and they say, well, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to travel, or I'm going to spend more time with my family, or I'm going to just shake loose of the day-to-day of work, right? But as they do that, they find they're able to examine more who they are when they're not working and take on some additional identities other than work. And that's where the transformation starts to happen. And it doesn't happen in week 1 or week 2. It might not even happen until like 6 months in that you start to be able to have the time and space to integrate sort of what you've come to terms with, having time away from work.
I think we've all had the experience of driving home along sort of a well-traveled path, and almost like you wake up in your home and you weren't even sort of cognizant of all the driving you did in the middle because you're so familiar with it. And I think a lot of us can kind of sleepwalk through our professional lives as well when we're sort of locked in, a typical rut, locked in our 9 to 5.
Yeah.
And see where a sabbatical, even if it wasn't undertaken for sort of explicitly growthy reasons, just the mixing it up a little bit would lead to growth, would lead to improvement just by virtue of sort of shaking out the cobwebs of that sleepwalking through life. So you're the perfect person. I want 40% of my listeners to take a sabbatical, and I want to create a world where this is more accepted. And I think when I talk about this myself, when I hear other people talk about it, sort of the first practical impediment that's always thrown up is the financial piece of it.
Yeah.
And you are, of course, the perfect person to talk about this, being both an advisor and an expert in all things sabbatical. How should someone start to think about the financial realities of preparing for a sabbatical, and how will they know they're ready?
Yeah. So I think step 1 is to figure out what stage you're in the process. Are you considering this? Are you planning it? Are you beginning your sabbatical, or you're in the process of executing, right? Just to get clear on where you're at with this. The other thing to consider is this a planned thing or an unplanned thing? Because let's get real here. A lot of people have to take unplanned sabbaticals. They might not call it a sabbatical because it doesn't feel like that, but getting laid off, having a reduction in force, or having to take time off to care for an ailing family member or yourself in an unplanned way. I mean, this can necessitate taking a sabbatical, and it might mean that it's a bit more unplanned than someone who had time to plan for it, right? So it's definitely okay if you're a victim of circumstance and it's an unplanned situation. Taking an inventory of your resources is always going to be really important. So the financial resources, but also your emotional resources, like who you have around you to support you. Maybe there's organizations that are there to kind of create, structure and socialization while you're off, right? When you go from having coworkers to not having coworkers, that can be a challenge. Just your general environment and the people around you. Having an inventory of all these things is really useful. And then, if your resources let you know that creating a savings plan is your next right step, then you can follow some simple math. If you save 10%, just 10% of your take-home pay, you could afford to take a 6-month sabbatical every 5 years or so. You have to balance this, of course, with your other savings goals. You can't stop saving for retirement during these 5 years. You still need an emergency fund. You need all these things, right? But what this math shows us is that really anyone, regardless of income, if this is a priority for you, it can be done. And, if you increase your savings rate, say 30%, you could fund a 6-month sabbatical in far less than 2 years. So you could get really clear on this, that this is the next thing that you want to do, and you can make it happen. You can create a self-funded sabbatical and give this as a gift to yourself as a priority. Obviously, a bonus, a tax refund, stock award can jumpstart or be a catalyst for savings when we're talking about creating a savings plan. But people can also get really creative. I have some stories in my book. Someone rented their house on Airbnb and decided to move to a lower cost of living area for 6 months, living off the rent earned on their home, right? I heard of another story recently of someone teaching English in a fellowship program abroad and using that as a way to have income while you're on sabbatical. So there's plenty of ways you can get creative. Another thing as we talk about burnout or needing to recover from burnout, most large employers have a program called FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, it means your employer has to hold your job for you for 3 months. They're not required to pay you during that time, but you could couple that with like short-term disability as a claim and get maybe 60% of your salary during that time. And it's just a matter of working with your employer around like what approvals you have to get in place to handle that. And it's usually a doctor's note. It's usually, some forms and paperwork and things like that. So there's a whole array of things that you can do to start planning for this, but it's certainly something that anyone or everyone could consider at some point with a little planning.
It's so much more doable. Like when I hear you lay out the numbers, and again, you're a financial planner. When I hear you lay out the numbers, I think it feels so much more in reach than I would have previously thought. Just a couple of follow-ups. You said 2 or 3 things that made me want to explore a little further. Have you found sort of a sweet spot in terms of time? You use 6 months as an example. Have you found in your observation, in your study, like, is there a time that's too short? Is there a time where people start to get antsy and it's too long? What have you found about the optimal time, understanding that your mileage will vary, of course?
Mm-hmm. It really takes at least a month, if not 6 weeks, to just decompress from work life and forget about all the day-to-day mini crises and emergencies that go on and settle into what I call just sort of, maybe unstructured space or the actual work break. And so, the typical sabbatical that maybe employers would offer is only around that much, like 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Maybe some might offer a 6-week sabbatical if an employer is offering you this as a benefit. And so it's really only scratching the surface at that point. I think the true benefits really start to come after several months off. Like sometimes people really need at least 3 months or 4 months to really kind of decompress from burnout and start to be able to focus on something other than just recharge, right? And then you want to have time to enjoy it too, right? It's the hobby that you want to take up, right? It's the travel that you want to do with your family, the writing project that you want to take on. It's taking on some of those things that you wouldn't have time for within a normal 9-to-5 job. And that's where I think some of that identity work really comes in and starts to happen and unfold, is you just start to discover who you are when you're not working and you like that, right? And so a surprising thing that I see in my work is that people set out to take, maybe let's call it a 6-month sabbatical, but they get to the 6-month mark and they're like, I've barely scratched the surface here. Most people take an additional 3 months beyond what they even initially thought, because it really just becomes something that is so fruitful and exciting, and it takes time, right?
So I have a buddy from home who, after 27 years of working at one company, was laid off, rather unceremoniously late last year, like I believe October of last year. And initially he thought, he's doing fine, has, good savings and all this, and is, good degree, very employable. And he said, look, I'm going to take the holidays off and then I'm going to hit it hard at the beginning of the year. And, here we are 9 months later and he's having so much fun. I think having so much fun that he hasn't even started. And I think he's deepening relationships. He's learning about himself. He's thinking deeply about, after nearly 3 decades at one company, what does he want to really do now with this second half of his, second chapter of his employment life. Yeah. And it's been interesting to watch my own reaction, because it's like a mix of jealousy and horror, I think, I'm like, hey, wow. Like on the one hand, I'm really jealous of all the fun stuff he's doing and all he's learning. And then on the other hand, I worry, and some amount of that is projection, I'm sure. I'm like, is he going to be able to sort of re-enter polite society, right? Like, Is he too feral when he comes back from this sabbatical? We'll talk about that in a moment. I think a worry with FMLA, right, is that there's sort of the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, right? We know that, yes, FMLA exists. It exists for good reasons. But it feels like, again, only speaking for myself, coming to my employer and saying like, hey, I need a break and I'm going to use FMLA for this. I've always envisioned it as being for, I don't know, other stuff. And it feels like it feels like a worry would be, well, this might get held against you. What would you say to, to someone who says, look, I fear using FMLA for reasons of burnout, for fear of sort of, stigma or making myself a pariah internally or making people feel as though I'm not hardworking or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely something that everyone has to wrestle with. But the truth is, mental health struggles are health struggles and they are protected under HR law. And you should not fear having retribution for something like this. It should be very well spelled out in your employer handbook. And it should be something that you feel comfortable talking to HR about to figure out what the policies are. And this, of course, applies to larger employers. If you work for a company that has 5 employees, these types of things might not even exist. And certainly FMLA might not even be a part of what they're required to comply with. So you do need to do a little bit of digging. But I've heard stories actually of people who didn't even know that a sabbatical program existed within their organization until they started digging into their employer manuals and figuring out, oh, there's actually some of these things actually exist, and maybe I don't have to take FMLA. And so, there's a study by Society of Human Resource Management that they found there's about 400 companies that offer a sabbatical program, some of them paid, some of them unpaid, but they were able to itemize and list through a survey that many companies. And you wouldn't think that if this word doesn't really enter into everyday conversations, right? As much as you think. If there were 400 companies offering this, I mean, that's almost the S&P 500, right? Yeah. So it is something that I think more and more employers are seeing and accepting, and it continues to go. Your fears are just simply probably associated with a lot of the fears around mental health stigma generally. And I think the more we talk about it, the more we raise awareness of it, the more that stigma sort of goes away.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm literally a psychologist, and here I am, someone with a PhD in psychology, fearful of stigma around mental health, and sort of even having sort of bought into the cultural conception of burnout or mental health struggles being less real than physical struggles. It either tells you that I'm deeply broken or that these things are deeply ingrained in sort of our cultural consciousness, probably a little of column A, a little of column B. What is our stigma, right? Why this stigma? We've touched on it a bit. Why this stigma around taking breaks, and how did we sort of arrive at this wonky conception we have of like decades of work followed by decades of leisure, rather than a more integrated sort of process of working and taking breaks?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've been taught from a young age to define ourselves by what we do. First, it's, what do you want to be when you grow up? Then what's your major? What do you want to do for work? And then what do you do for work at cocktail parties, right? You may have parents who had to scrimp and save just to have food on the table and new clothes every school year, right? Or maybe you had parents who came to this country to work hard and create a better life for their families. And now you're trying to say to them, I'm going to take a break from work. The idea of intentionally taking time off would be so unfathomable to our grandparents, to our parents, simply because that was not an option. That wasn't a resource that we had. We had to, those people had to work to get their pension, to, prove that they could provide for their families. And to take a break might have meant that they wouldn't be employable in the future, right? And if you say to someone, I'm thinking of taking some time off, they might automatically assume in their brain due to some of these generational aspects that there's some kind of trouble afoot, right? It's often associated with bad things like, getting fired or having to take care of an ailing family member, personal issues, right? Taking time off is sort of, it's like it's like something that you say when something bad maybe has happened, right? And so now, though, we're entering an era, and sometimes this is even like regional, right? Like the East Coast is still a little bit more uncomfortable with this concept. The West Coast is maybe a little bit more comfortable with the idea of taking work breaks. But we're entering an era where people are able to financially and able to just generally take time off for so many other reasons, like, finishing a dissertation or writing a book, or, being more healthy, taking on a health approach to your life, volunteering, learning a new skill. There's all sorts of things you could do on a work break that are completely fruitful. They're exciting. They're life-giving. They're not life-taking away. And we're also living a lot longer. And the life that we have in older age is healthier and more mobile and free. So why not have a system or move towards a system where we take breaks early and often and maybe work a few more years to get there? And I think it's a really beautiful thing to be able to reimagine what work norms are. They just haven't yet quite caught up with us. We're still in the manufacturing age of KPIs and OKRs and this alphabet soup of doing more with less. And I think we're starting to see that change.
It's fascinating. I was doing some research the other day, and it was talking about if you compress the timeline of humanity down to a single year, right? The pyramids were built on Christmas Day. This country was founded late on December 29th. And, as of the founding of this country, December 29th, and to use our metaphor here, almost 90% of the world lived on what would today be $2 or less, right? Poverty was just so widespread and so backbreaking. And now that number is under 10%. And of course, we're living in the richest society in human history and here in the US. There's just a level of wealth and a level of capacity that hasn't existed historically. For almost all of human existence, you were scraping and clawing to get enough calories and to get by. And we find ourselves in this abundant moment, but there's an abundance of wealth, but sometimes a paucity of wellness, like an absence of wellness or mental well-being. And I think the rules have changed, and we'd be wise to change along with them sometimes. Okay, so they've listened to you now. They've saved that money. They've overcome the stigma. They're ready to go. What are just a couple of your do's and don'ts for putting together a meaningful sabbatical?
Yeah, the don't that comes to mind is don't busy your way through a work break. It can be such a temptation to do all the pent up things that have been languishing because we're on a busy work schedule, right? But busying your way through a work break, it really just trades one type of to-do list with another, and it keeps our nervous system ramped up at super high speeds, right? On full blast. We don't get the time to heal. So I always tell people to plan for significant amounts of unstructured time. No plans, no obligations, no to-do lists, right? And I always say that when you get bored, it's actually a sign. It's a good sign. It means there's probably some change on the horizon. And it's a sign that you're getting to a point where change is even possible. Whereas before, you were solely defined by what you did. Now you can begin to include some of this identity work around other aspects of your life, right? Some other things you can do that I would recommend is definitely focus on exploring new things, like whether that's hobbies or art or just being creative in some form or capacity, being in nature, finding wonder and awe in beauty in life. Find a way to, as you engage in those things and learn new things, journal or integrate what you learn through that process, because this is such a precious time. You want to make sure that you can remember it and you can prioritize what you felt like back then when you took that work break and bring some of that back with you when you go back to work, right? There's things, it's a changed process. So we want to make sure we bring with us some of the things we learned and some of the things we loved when we do go back to work. And that's going to mean that work becomes a little bit more sustainable and a little bit more reasonable, so we don't put ourselves back into a potential burnout situation.
Yeah, I think your leading story was a great example of that, right? The lessons that you learned on sabbatical are woven through your day to day, and you brought those with you. I can also see taking a sabbatical as just a new form of to-do list, right? Like when I've even contemplated it for myself, it'd be like, well, I'm going to write the great American novel. I'm going to get in great shape, like whatever it is, it's just substituting one to-do list for another, and allowing yourself to get bored is like awfully hard advice, I think, for some of us who have been switched on for a very long time.
Yeah, I think it goes back to some of the work norms we talked about too. It's like, I think all of us feel worthy and worth something when we're working. And that's the reason that drives us to do so much in our work lives. And so when we have the chance to not work, we feel like we need to fill it with things to still feel worthy. And there's room for that, but there's also room to try to let go of some of that and hold it a lot more loosely in our lives, so that we're not defined by what we do or not do. We're defined more about, our experiences and the energy that we bring into the world.
So people have listened to your advice. They've taken that sabbatical. Now they're preparing for reentry. One of the worries that I have, candidly, we see, for instance, parents who leave the workforce for a time to raise children. I mean, they're penalized for that in observable ways in terms of their career progression, their salary. What can be done to minimize sort of career harm upon reentry, if you will?
Yeah. I mean, I always advise my clients to do a little bit of self-talk, right? It's like, you have not lost your experience, your wisdom, your value because you took time away. You haven't lost any of that. In fact, you've gained more by taking time away because you've gained new experiences in your life that you can bring to the workforce. We all are whole humans. We all bring our whole lives and our whole experiences to the work that we do. And that is our unique perspective, and that is our unique value. And so it's important to remember that. It's also important to remember that this gap, the notion of a gap, is not as big of a deal as it once was. You may actually not get questions about it at all if you just write, I took a self-paid sabbatical on my resume, right? But if you do get questions, you can turn it into an opportunity to develop rapport with the interviewer, right? You can just generally explain what you did, whether you worked on hobbies, you volunteered, you spent time with family. You can keep it really high level, leave it at that, or you could tell an interesting story that makes you interesting and intriguing to the interviewer. And it's worth planning ahead in advance, not just the stories that you're going to tell about your work life and your experiences, but maybe incorporate a few stories from your sabbatical that show that this was a valuable experience, and I'm bringing that too to the table when I come to work for this organization.
Yeah, it goes back to that, overcoming that stigma within, like in our own heads, and really selling that as not being apologetic about it,
no.
Or, talking about how fried you were, but, instead talking about all the things you learned on sabbatical and how it was the biggest boon to your career and your progress and your growth. I think if someone were to interview you about that, you'd have a lot of wonderful things to say and like things to point to about how it bettered you. So not being apologetic about that and framing it in a positive way. Are there any stories from your clients' lives or that you came across when writing the book of just really standout sort of transformative experiences that occurred on sabbatical?
I've had a lot of clients straight up just completely change the work that they do after taking a work break, right? They start off thinking, oh, I'm just going to take this break and then I'm going to go get reemployed in whatever it is that I've been doing. Instead, what happens is they have that time and space and they realize, it would be nice to just do something a little different with my life. And a lot of people pursue self-employment as a result because it is one way to get a lot of flexibility in not just what you do or who you work with, but you have more control over your time. You have more control over when you work and where you spend your energy. And so that's a definitely a common theme is a transition to self-employment.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So as promised, the last couple minutes we've got here, as promised, I told you I was going to get free therapy. So my employer Orion has a program, I believe it's every 7 years, where you get a 2-week sabbatical. Now in Europe, that's called a vacation. In the US, 2 weeks is a sabbatical. So we have a 2-week paid sabbatical, which I'm very, very excited about. In fact, I'm so excited about it that I'm completely paralyzed by it. I have not had 2 weeks off basically ever. And the prospect of this is making me so happy that I have no idea what to do with it. And really the two things that I'm sort of struggling with, on the one hand, like I want to go somewhere awesome, right? Like I've always wanted to go to Japan. There's lots of other parts of the world that I haven't seen. And I'm like, let's blow it out. Let's make this sabbatical memorable. Like, let's go to Japan. But the reality is I travel a lot for work, like a lot. And so like, another, a 15-hour flight times 2, a trip to Japan is sort of just like more doing on top of more doing. So then the other thing I'm considering is like, far on the other side of that, just like I'm going to take 2 weeks. I'm not going to shave. I'm not, I'm not going to bathe. I'm going to do nothing. Like I'm going to get caught up on all my shows. It's going to be the most relaxing 2 weeks of my life. So deeply neurotic client me, right? Who has this gift and they don't know what to do with it. What would you tell someone like me to consider when they're trying to figure out how to spend that time?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first, congratulations. Like having a chunk of time like that is going to be such a luxury. And I know that either option are going to be amazing for you. So you have two really great choices, right? And I think you probably know deep down, if you really took the time, which you would prefer, which would be most beneficial to your family, right? But there's ways that you can explore it, right? I would encourage you to maybe spend some time writing or journaling about it. A technique you probably know is like non-dominant handwriting exercises, right? It kind of gets into another side of our brain where it maybe like unlocks sort of a deeper secret that we might have, right? But I will say from experience that most people, when they take their first sabbatical, they do focus on travel. And they quickly realize that they're going to want and need subsequent sabbaticals to find more ways to rest, recharge, and even do maybe foundational work to transform their working life. So this doesn't have to be like a one and done thing. Like, there doesn't have to be scarcity around the idea of taking a 2-week break, a 2-week chunk. And I think, you could look at it more like dipping your toe in the water to figure out how you can do this again. And maybe not have to wait 7 years to do it.
Yeah. I think that's a really powerful reframe, because I know that I am approaching it from a scarcity mindset. It's like, look, there's this thing. It was hard won. I don't know, when it's coming back around. And so Kierkegaard says that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. Like I'm dizzy with possibility, right? There's so many things that I want to do that I can't quite seem to do anything. But I think, reframing it in that abundance mindset, this isn't the last 2-week break I'll ever have, and just trying to do something nice with it, and knowing that other things will come around. So beautiful. Well, in closing, tell us about the book, tell us where we can find it and how we can support your most worthwhile work.
Yeah. So my book, The Art of the Sabbatical, is now available everywhere books are sold. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, of course, and you can also ask your local bookstore to get it in their shop. So widely available. I'm currently working on the audiobook version, so that's going to be out later this year, which I'm excited about. So yeah.
Do you read your own audiobooks?
I do. I narrate my own.
Everyone's always frustrated that I don't, but I don't quite, I don't know. Nobody wants to hear however many hours of an Alabama accent reading to them about behavioral finance. Well, congratulations. A quick aside from another author. If you do, first of all, go check out the book. Please support Cady's work. And if you love the book, tell a friend about it, review it, talk about it. You know, I'm out here promoting the Soul of Wealth right now, and I can speak to firsthand how fun and how frustrating the process of trying to get in the world can be. So when people do good work, support them with your dollars and with your support. So Cady, wonderful to have you back, and congratulations on a wonderful work.
Thanks so much, Daniel.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.